Mr Speaker.
I call the member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Education Amendment Bill number 2 represents a hugely wasted opportunity to make some changes that would genuinely increase the quality of teaching in New Zealand and genuinely lead to better outcomes for New Zealand students. The review of the Teachers' Council was welcomed by the whole profession. There was nobody in the teaching profession that thought that things that were going swimmingly well and that there wasn't room for improvement. Everybody that I have spoken to in the teaching profession believes that there is a significant role for a regulatory body like the Teachers' Council to set the standards of entry into the teaching profession, to review and manage the registration and renewal of practising certificates, and to manage the competency and disciplinary functions that the Council should have. Everybody accepts that there is a role for that body, and the teaching profession want to ensure that it is a quality body that will genuinely be owned and driven by the profession. So right from the outset, this bill is flawed, and the measures in this bill are flawed because it simply removes the autonomy of that whole teaching profession away and gives the complete control of the regulation of the profession to the government. All of the appointees on the Council of the Education Council of Aotearoa New Zealand, or EduCans, will be selected by the Minister. And what other profession that we genuinely believe is a profession and that we genuinely respect the autonomy of would we do that to? We don't do it to lawyers, to doctors, to engineers, don't even do it to real estate agents, and yet the government seem to think that they can take complete control of the profession. And I can see the knowing smile there from the member in the chair. But it is absolutely important that we ensure that the profession, if this is going to be a professional body for teachers, that teachers feel that they have some ownership over it, and they simply don't. The Minister of Education mentioned in her opening remarks in this debate that there was widespread consultation and there were a huge number of submissions to the Select Committee. That's true. There was widespread consultation and there were a huge volume of submissions to the Select Committee, and those submissions were listened to, but they were not heard, because the government members sat there on their email checking their messages. They did not listen, because the overwhelming feedback from the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who came along and gave up their time to have their say on this bill was that they were opposed to it, that they did not support the provisions of the bill, and they made some very constructive suggestions for improvement. Because, like I said, there's not a teacher in the country that doesn't want the education system to be better. That is why they go to work every single day. They want better outcomes for Kiwi kids, and they have been completely ignored by this government and the changes that are being made in this legislation. So while there was widespread consultation, it was listened to, but it was not heard. The government are going to handpick all of the members of this council. I went and had a look at what other jurisdictions do. In Australia, they have elected representatives. In Scotland, in England, in all of those other countries where we look at to compare our education system, they all have some form of elected representation on the professional body for teachers. Not here, not in New Zealand, under a national government. This bill creates huge duplication of roles and confuses responsibilities rather than clarifying them. For example, the bill gives the Education Council of Aotearoa New Zealand the responsibility for sharing best practice. Isn't that the role of the Ministry of Education, the Education Review Office, the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, the New Zealand Council for Education Research, and so many other government agencies, and now it's being given to another agency, and it's simply dissecting that very important task down even further and confusing more roles. And of course it adds to the burden of costs on individual teachers themselves, because who pays for this? It's not the taxpayer, it's not the government, it's actually individual teachers. Their teaching registration fees are going to go up. Now, most teachers that I've spoken to would say, well, what are we going to get from this increase in the cost of our teacher registration? Because a lot of it is simply going to go into bureaucracy. So, another example. The bill requires 10% of all practising certificate renewals in any given year to be audited. That audit will be a paper-based process undertaken in Wellington. It will not result in one additional appraisal of a teacher in their classroom. Not one. It will not result in one additional person sitting in somebody's classroom, monitoring their teaching and giving them constructive feedback on how they can be better teachers. This is going to increase bureaucracy. It's going to increase bureaucracy that individual teachers will pay for, and it is not going to increase the quality of teaching and learning that takes place in our classrooms. What we need to do is take best practice and make it common practice without making it standard practice. Because when we make it standard practice, it becomes a form-filling, compliance, bureaucratic exercise, and it completely defeats the purpose, and that is what this bill does. Everyone will have seen news stories about people who simply shouldn't be in classrooms because somehow they've fallen through the cracks and something bad has happened. Let's be clear about this. The provisions of this bill would not have changed the outcome in any one of those cases. Not one of those people who shouldn't have been teaching would have been prevented from getting into the classroom by the provisions of this bill. It would not have made one bit of difference. We all agree that we don't want people who shouldn't be in classrooms. So how can we effectively do that? Well, it actually starts with quality professional development from the top of the system to the bottom. School boards of trustees need quality professional development when it comes to the recruitment and appraisal of school principals. School principals need quality professional development when it comes to the recruitment, appraisal and professional development for their teaching staff. And yes, principals need support on how to deal with teachers who aren't performing. Because at the end of the day, who is responsible for removing teachers from classrooms who shouldn't be there? In most cases, in almost every instance, the first port of call for that is the school's principal. And if the school's principal isn't being supported in that role, then we're going to end up with teachers in classrooms who shouldn't be there. This bill does nothing, absolutely nothing to deal with that. It does nothing to provide the additional support to where it will actually make a difference. These are not functions that should be undertaken by regulators. These are functions that should be undertaken in schools by getting the right support in the right place. This bill simply isn't going to deliver on any of that. There is a disconnection, for example, between the Education Review Office, who will go in and audit whether a school's doing what it should do in terms of its teacher appraisal processes, but then there's a disconnect for where the support comes. So if a school has found to have ineffective leadership, there hasn't been early enough intervention in that. If it is found that a school doesn't have the right systems in place for the development of their staff, the follow-up is so critical, and yet there is a real disconnect. Those are the things that we should be debating. Those are the things that the government should be working on fixing. This bill doesn't address any of them. The Education Council of Aotearoa New Zealand is being set up to fail from the beginning. It's being set up to fail because it doesn't have the support of the profession, because they don't have any say on who's going to be on the governing body of it. It is set up to fail because it is being given a massive increase in its remit compared to what the Teachers' Council had, and yet, as we know from past experience, the Teachers' Council hadn't fully got on top of the remit that it already had. There was room for improvement there, and they were making incredible strides. They were making big improvements, but to throw more responsibilities onto them before they have really nailed down what they were already doing is simply irresponsible, and yet that's what this bill and this government are doing at the moment. And isn't there an enormous double standard at play here, where the government talk about wanting to increase the quality of teaching, increase the status of the teaching profession, and yet they say charter schools don't have to employ registered and qualified teachers, and then they talk about the Education Council having to have openness as its default setting, and yet charter schools have no such provisions, not subject to the OIA, and this government still won't release their quarterly reports from last year. So while they're enrolling new kids for this year, they still won't tell anybody how those schools actually performed last year. This is bad legislation. It is bad for the teaching profession. It's not going to result in better education for New Zealand kids. That's what the government should be focused on. This is going to increase bureaucracy, increase red tape, and it is not going to result in the removal of one ineffective teacher from any school in New Zealand.
Speaker. Dr. Jin Yang.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker.
So I've called Dr. Jin Yang.